Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the second half of our 2022 Spring Publishing Symposium. I hope many of you were with us for the past hour for an amazing conversation about researching against bias. And a lot of that conversation really kind of laid the groundwork for this focus on publishing. There were a lot of questions and comments that came up there that I think our publishing experts will be very well equipped to address. I'm Lori Matheson. I'm the director of the University of Illinois Press, and I'm just so excited to be presenting this collaborative event, co-sponsored by the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs and by the Humanities Research Institute at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. The panel we're about to see, Opening the Blinds, Practicing Inclusive Publishing, brings together publishing professionals from multiple scholarly presses to share how publishers are working to develop anti-racist and anti-bias practices in scholarly publishing, from acquisitions and peer review to copy editing and design, to marketing and promotion, and also commercial and open access models, I think will also be part of the conversation. Diversity, equity, and inclusion work has been a major focus of the Association of University Presses, our professional association, or one of them, especially coming to the fore in the past half-dozen years. This work has included intensive training at the director level and a heavy emphasis in programming at the association's annual meeting and in webinars and other professional development events, which is just a kind of a long way of saying that it's really on all of our minds and part of our work to try to move the needle in this area. All of our editors are models in their lists and their daily work of an ethic of inclusion that shapes their publication programs and also the processes of their respective presses. Again, I'm thrilled to welcome these talented publishing professionals and very excited to learn from them. So please take it away.
Thank you very much, Lori, and to all for joining us today and spending some time in conversation and learning with us. I'm Christie Henry, director of Princeton University Press. She, her, hers are my pronouns. It is an absolute honor to introduce you to three incredible panelists. I'm humbled and inspired by their actions and their leadership in the necessary evolution of university press publishing, and we will all learn about what they've achieved so far and what they aspire to do in the future. Mike Baccam is an acquisitions editor at the University of Washington Press, where he primarily works in the fields of Asian American studies, critical ethnic studies, Western U.S. history. He's currently a member of the Equity, Justice, and Inclusion Committee of the Association of University Presses as well. Dominique Moore acquires in American Ethnic Studies, Black Studies, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Illinois Press. One question Dominique likes to see authors tackle is how do marginalized people assert themselves and establish communities in ways that defy time and space? She's also currently a member of the EJI committee of the AUPresses. Sara Jo Cohen is senior acquiring editor at the University of Michigan Press, where she handles titles in American Studies, Music, and Media Studies. Each of us on this panel, while Lori has introduced us in an expansive way in terms of the topics we'll be talking about tonight, we wanted, in the interest of transparency, to share with you that each of us brings acquisitions experience to the conversation. We will be as broad in our perspectives and comments as we possibly can, and where we can't answer questions, we will make sure to point you in the directions where those questions can be answered. We all absolutely believe in the transformative power of open dialogue, and so we invite you to contribute to the discussion either using the Q&A or the chat function, and we'll bring your questions and comments into the space as they arise. Sarah's going to be monitoring the Q&A in the chat. If we miss anything, please repost, we'll get there. And we want to clarify that questions are not at all going to be perceived as disruptions, but rather we'll use them to guide us in our conversation tonight. And with that, we're going to start this conversation. So let's start with the larger context. I'm going to ask the panelists to come off their mute and answer when they feel or when they're inspired to answer. First question, can you define what it means to be an inclusive publisher?
Well, I can go first. I would say what I increasingly am keeping in mind is the role that acquisitions editors in particular should play in educating their authors, both about publishing in specific, but in general of how, can you hear me now? I think someone said they couldn't hear me. So I'll start the answer over. So I think that what acquisitions editors increasingly have to do is be educators and educate authors, not only on publishing in specific, but also on the role that publishing plays in their career at large. And so in doing that, I believe that that's part of the work and of equity, right? Making sure that as many people that I engage with have the same set of information. Because that's something that I saw kind of coming up in the ranks, is that depending on, I always call it this laying on of hands experience, depending on who has brought you up through the ranks as an academic, you could just have very different pieces of information, even when it comes to cultural norms in publishing. And so I believe that that's probably the work that I increasingly see myself being responsible to.
Great, Dom. Would you see that as kind of the hidden curriculum of publishing?
Absolutely.
In other words, it's something we're trying to make more transparent. It sounds like we're still getting a low volume on you, Dom. I'm not sure if there's a way to, at least that's coming up twice in the chat. We'll see if that can get better. Could somebody chat, or is everything else coming through okay in terms of acoustics? I'm going to assume yes, if we don't hear otherwise. Okay. Okay. Great, thank you. So building on Dominique's answer, Mike, are you willing to share with us some things that you've done to make things more transparent?
Sure, yeah. I guess going back to the first question you asked, just for me, there's like several levels to it, right? It's like taking care of people at a personal level and getting your allegiances right. Right. So, you know, making sure that your authors are taken care of, making sure that people are getting the things they need in their careers is more important than, you know, what we need as a press, right? You just sometimes it's easy to put your allegiances with your employer, but really you're serving your authors, right? And so, like Dom was saying, it's being transparent with them, being upfront with them about what we do, what they can expect, not, you know, not only talking to people who have been referred to you or in certain networks and things like that, or from certain institutions, right? And writing people off who don't come from those networks. I think that's at the personal level, just making sure that we're taking care of each other, because it is a collaborative process. It is a thing where we're working together. Yeah, I mean, I think there's other layers to it, right? Making sure that your colleagues are, that we're good to our colleagues and our coworkers, and trying to lift each other up. And of course, you know, Dom and I are on the EJI committee, and you know, there's big picture things that we can do too. It takes longer to turn the ship around or burn the ship down or whatever we got to do with the ship, you know, but we got to keep an eye on it. And but yeah, there's the kind of like in the meantime stuff that we can do, and then there's, you know, fighting for bigger, better change. So, or more,
building more ships.
Yeah, broader, and yeah, more ships. So.
Yeah, right. Sara, continuing on that theme, what are some ways that you've been thinking about how we are giving the opportunities and uplifting each other and treating each other well and equally, building on Mike's sharing about how do we look for those signs of equality and inclusion and belonging in developing new networks, in breaking networks? What are some of the acquisitions approaches?
Hard question, Christy.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. But yeah, building on what Mike said, I think I really appreciated what both Mike and Dom said. And I think that, you know, I think transparency, which Dom's talking about, is super important. And I think that what Mike was saying about taking care of people is super important. And so I think sort of in all the relationships, right, as we're building new boats and as we're trying to fill those boats with people, like the important things that we need to be doing are being transparent about how things work and how we work, and also taking care of ourselves and of each other, right? And that's something I hope we can kind of come back to. I imagine that care is going to become a sort of central theme here. So.
Great.
Yeah, I just want to echo the self-care thing too. Yeah, we got to draw our lines. And,
I didn't mean to put myself first. I said, you know, take care of ourselves and others. But yeah, I mean, we do have to be aware of that. And there is a question coming through in the chat. Do you want me to read this, Christie, or
that would be great?
Okay, so Nikita Thomas is asking, how would you know where to start and what to ask when you're new to publishing, especially as someone whose work decenters whiteness and focuses on emerging practices? Is there a resource for those new to publishing in R1 institutions / environments, a book, a resource center, etc.? And I think we did have some comments prepared on this, so maybe we could shift to talk a little bit about where to look for resources as you're starting to get into publishing.
That would be great. Dom, are you willing to take that on? So this is coming from somebody new to the publishing community, not as an author, but as a colleague, it sounds like. Am I reading that right, Nikita? Only because we want to point, yes, got it. Okay, great,
so
thank you.
Publishing,
okay.
They're not an author.
Yes, correct. Yeah,
Actually,
thanks for clarifying, Nikita.
Thank you. Yeah, because I definitely didn't get that. New resources. I mean, I always try to say that those of us who are especially very vocal are going to be really great resources, right? I'm always willing to have a conversation on Twitter and LinkedIn and email or in person about publishing. I probably have just as many conversations with academics looking to maybe leave academia for publishing at conferences as I do people looking to get books published. And so asking people their real experiences, I do believe that people are feeling comfortable to become more transparent about what they're experiencing on the ground, right? And I also do believe that, oh goodness, I just lost it. The other resources. Let's leave it there for now because it just left my brain, the other resource.
I want to call out Dom's great initiative to do this, the early and mid-career buddy system, right? So I don't know where that's advertised. You want
with my girl Becca Bostic.
Right, with Becca.
All
yes,
right.
Yes, we love Becca as well. So yeah, there's a fantastic initiative program of pairing people up so they can have a buddy to go through the messy systems of these early and mid-career levels. So that's, connecting with folks, networking, it can be really intimidating, but yeah, there are ways that things have been set up so you could get paired up. So.
Great, thank you, Mike, for pointing that out. In terms of resources for learning about, in addition to what's been shared, there is the mentor-mentee program. I think also throughout the community, while it can be it can be intimidating to ask, there are plenty of people in the community who are keen to share experiences, and I think asking colleagues at your press for advice. I've shared Dom's Twitter handle there, and if you follow Dom, you'll find some other really interesting people who are sharing, and really leaders in this community who are sharing information, trying to make publishing more transparent. So if you're engaged in social media, I would encourage you to think more about that. We'll also post in, I was going to share, there are a couple of other resources, but some of these are both for careers in publishing and for those who are interested in more information about university presses who might be on the call. Great. Okay, let's talk a little bit about, from an author's perspective, what should authors be looking for signs that they are approaching a press that has made equity and inclusion and anti-racism a pillar of their program? What would you recommend that they be seeking out to be sure that they're approaching the places that will support them in their endeavors?
And I can start. There's into this one. someone in the last panel said that, and I can't remember who it is right now because I don't have my notes in front of me, that it's really important to talk to your colleagues about who they've worked with and feel safe working with, and they feel supportive of the kind of work that they're doing. And I think that that's huge. I mean, I think that word of mouth is a big way that you find that out. I think a lot of university presses, like especially sort of post George Floyd, started putting up statements about anti-racism on their websites. And so I think you can find those usually in the About Us section, but I don't know that those statements are always the best way to find out who are the best individuals to work with, right? And so I think asking folks in your network, and I think you can ask editors point blank. I mean, I've had editors put me on the spot and say, like, I'm an anti-racist scholar, what are you doing to further the cause? And then I say, well, actually, and I think that you should feel really comfortable asking editors that. And if an editor isn't comfortable answering that question, they're probably not somebody that you want to work with.
Great. Mike, are you willing to give some further thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I can try, but so I unmuted myself before I. Okay. So I'm committed now. But that was thoughtfulness, intentionality. Somebody talk to your editor, talk to editors. When you're shopping around or not shopping around your manuscript, or just at a conference, and see who is paying attention and wants to talk to you, and even. Like, I love talking to people, even if their book projects are totally outside my field, right? And just like helping folks figure out where to place their projects, right? So we're all in this together. And in my early days as an acquiring editor, like I remember Sara was just so kind at conferences, right? And I could, it was really heartening to know that I could send people to her, or send folks who just needed some advice to her. You can get it through word of mouth. Just chat us up at conferences or send us emails. If you're at a campus, reach out to folks on your campus, right? Like, I love talking to people at Washington, even if I'm not interested in their project, right? So.
Right. We should make that point, right? If you're at an institution that has a press, I hope that there's some bridges between your institution and the press. It's not a given, but those bridges can still be built. So please do think about ways to do that. Dom, anything else that you want to add about how to what are the signals and cues that a press might be prioritizing equity and inclusion and anti-racism work, looking maybe even beyond acquisition? So again, we're trying to think about how to focus on the whole life cycle.
Yeah, I mean, you asked me this question at a different time of the year. I think I have a different answer. I would say look at a press's backlist. I think that lets you know where their priorities are and where they've always been. Whereas it's very great to see the uptick in equity and inclusion and initiatives that presses have put forth. I would be remiss if I didn't say that, taking myself out of the equation, not working in the industry, there is something to always be careful of and mindful of if this is performative and how. And I do believe that a great way, again, to mark that is to see what type of authors from what type of places have presses always been invested in publishing, kind of pre-pandemic phase. I think I can say I saw a shift post-pandemic and post kind of these new movements happening, and how presses not only acquired, but also how they marketed what they were acquiring. And so, yeah, I would put that part. So maybe some deep backlist research, and reach out to other authors that have worked with presses and ask them what their experience has been. I haven't seen any situation. I mean, I've had authors tell me that, oh, I talked to such and such, and they let me know that they had this experience. And so more so than even our network and publishing, any networks that you might be able to leverage independent of what's happening in this ecosystem is always going to be of benefit.
Right. Excellent point. We should also, for those who aren't in publishing, we should explain that backlist, well, the definition varies slightly from one press to the other. It's essentially books published earlier than a year ago And so it is this sort of the historic IP, intellectual property of any press is what Dom's recommending. We'll try to stop ourselves if we get into publishing speak in too many ways. There is a question I just want to turn to in the Q&A, because I think it's about some of those contemporary efforts, or maybe some of you are aware of something like this happening. And the question just
I accidentally bumped it into the
Thanks,
answer
Sara.
folder because I was trying to be helpful.
Back under answer. So the question is about whether there are any presses involved in redistributing economic resources. For example, and this is a great idea, do they make it possible for established authors or maybe multiple book authors to contribute their royalties to funds for independent or marginalized scholars? Anybody aware?
Well, I work at a press, well, for instance, the University of Illinois, we do have in our publishing agreement where we have a set of funds that anybody or an author that signed can decide to donate or allocate some of their royalties that they make to projects. One that often happens, I've worked at multiple presses that have had this, are first author funds. And so usually to cover some type of indexing or permission or cost that would be allocated oftentimes to the author. I would also like to be mindful of the fact that it is very press dependent, because I've also worked at presses that just don't have the resources to have, again, funds that are dedicated to those types of pursuits. And so it definitely does depend on, whatever press you're at.
Sara, anything you'd like to contribute to that? I'm just sticking a few things I know of in the chat.
Well, Christie, I wonder if you want to say a few words about the book proposal development grants that you have at Princeton, which are something, in addition to the UCP funds for first-gen authors. I admire your program a lot.
Thanks, Sara. I'd be glad to, and then I'll come back to putting some more stuff in the chat. So there are several grants. Princeton has been looking for ways that we can intervene across the life cycle, again, to sort of break networks and expand them. And we have global equity grants for authors who are under contract, who are underrepresented in the backlist of the press. So this is the way we're trying to sort of turn a ship. And those authors can apply for funding for a whole host of reasons. The majority of them in the pandemic have gone toward childcare. So we weren't, with the pandemic, creating further inequities in the list. The other thing that Sara mentioned that we started a year and a half ago are grants supporting diverse voices, book proposal grants. We recognize that not all authors have had training in creating book proposals. Not all publishers can give training in creating book proposals, but there is a great cohort of book proposal coaches who do this work. And so Princeton has offered now 3 rounds of grants to 15 grantees for each cycle to support the evolution of ideas into book proposals. We pay for the coaching services from a group of 5 partner coaches, soon to be 6. And those projects, when the proposals are ready, they come to Princeton for first option or consideration, but we're not insisting that contracts be signed with Princeton. So this is an opportunity, we hope, to put generally more books into the world by underrepresented and historically excluded demographics of scholars. Thank you, Sara, and I'm glad the chat has continued on this. Great. MIT also has an initiative. It's something they call Supporting Diverse Voices too, which is, I'll put a link to that in the chat as well.
Christie, another great question just came into the chat whenever you're ready.
About peer review, which connects us all as university presses. We do need to demonstrate that we all undertake the peer review process to be a part of this organization. So we have a number of editors who can speak to the peer review process. We can also share that the Association of University Presses has a handbook for peer review that's considered best practices of peer review that is soon to be released in a revised form. The first one was released, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago now. And the revision is very much focused on equity and inclusion in the peer review process. That should be released by the association this summer. I believe it will debut at the AUPresses meeting. If anybody has any other information on that they can share, we may have some people on the call who are part of that. But let's talk about peer review. Who would like to take that first? Sarah?
I don't want to talk too much, but I added a peer review question about this to my standard peer review questions, and it was something that I developed in conversations with editors at other presses, and then I sort of ran it by the folks at Michigan and adjusted it based on their comments, and then I ended up presenting it to our faculty executive committee, and that's a committee that we have that approves. They represent the university. They have to sign off on any book we want to publish to protect the imprimatur of the university, for folks who don't know that system. So anyway, I ended up just adding a question to my standard peer review that asks, like, to what extent does this manuscript represent the viewpoints, experiences, and stories of underrepresented groups, or something like that. I can share the exact wording in the chat when I dig it out of my notes. But that's been really helpful. I mean, some of my peer reviewers ignore it entirely, but an awful lot of them actually pay attention to it and have helped my manuscripts become stronger on that front. So I'll see if I can find the question and I'll drop it in the chat.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Mike, Dom, either of you want to build on that?
Yeah, I mean, we always want to be cognizant of who we're reaching out to, that we're not just having the same folks who are from the same generation, peer group, whatever, review the manuscripts to just kind of push them through, right? So thinking critically about how somebody, maybe a manuscript really should be addressing Indigenous matters more closely. And so instead of ignoring that, we have to send it to somebody who is sensitive, has expertise in that. So yeah, I mean, having a really thorough, generative peer review process is fundamental. Make sure that your press is paying the peer reviewers. That's important. And yeah, I'll stop there.
I always like to consider, so the first thing I always ask is who's being talked about in this manuscript and who is doing the talking. So I consider heavily what community the person who's writing about said community is from. And more so than that, I also try to listen for the silence, who's not being talked about in the manuscript, intentionally or unintentionally, and then trying to find a review process that builds from that and kind of reverse engineers that. Because sometimes a manuscript doesn't think it's engaging with a particular matter, and it actually isn't. It doesn't know that yet. And so having a review process that, again, is mindful of that is always at the top of my priority. But of course, you come up with hiccups even in that process. There are, for all intents and purposes, scholars who admittedly kind of bump up against the idea and don't like the idea of being asked to engage with matters of equity or inclusion. And in addition, I always ask, editors, or think that we as editors should read our reviews very critically that we're getting, because I have gotten reviews that I've had to ask myself in retrospect, again, considering the source, considering the reviewer, yeah, would they ask these revisions of a different type of author or a different type of scholar? Because it's not a anonymous review process. Your reviewer does know the author. And so I do have to consider that. And sometimes I'm like, that didn't feel right, what that's asking. And I don't believe that they'd ask that of another scholar. And for all intents and purposes, again, that's a phrase I'm using a lot today, I'll kind of just take it to board and I'll put that in consideration. I have no problem saying that I do believe that if the scholar was not blank, they wouldn't have been asked to do that in the review process.
Great. Okay, so authors on the call, I hope you're listening for some tips of how to be allies in the process too. And that's what you've just learned about in terms of peer review, if you're asked to review manuscripts. What about other things that you three as editors wish authors were thinking about more in being allies in inclusive publishing? maybe that's a good sign. Authors are doing everything they can.
There was, so in the previous panel, there were some really interesting points that came up that I know that some of you couldn't make it, some of my co-panelists. But some of the points that came up that I thought that were really interesting are that everyone on that panel, you would all be so proud of them, was saying that one of the most important things that authors can do to be good allies is to peer review manuscripts, right? And to support authors in that way, and to make sure that, you know, that that women, people of color, queer people are evaluating manuscripts, and it's not just the same old people over and over and over again. So I thought that was super. And one of the other things that came up in the last panel that I thought was great was the panelists were talking a little bit about open access publishing, and open access publishing as an opportunity for people to get their ideas out to as many people as possible without putting it behind a paywall. And so I think that that's something that, you know, I often talk to authors about how sometimes the politics of their work is such that I think it would be really great if we could figure out a way to make their book available open access so that the people that they're writing about can read it. So I thought that was neat. And maybe that'll give my colleagues on the panel some other ideas to spin off.
I would say that something that I wish I saw more, and I do believe I'm starting to see more, is folks that are not from said marginalized communities doing a better job educating themselves about how to review a project with those types of lens in mind, and equity-based, anti-racist, insert marginalized identity here perspective, because the reality also is that oftentimes scholars of color, trans scholars, queer scholars, scholars with disabilities, they're oftentimes already overtaxed and overworked by their institutions, and then also with the review process themselves. And so I always hesitate when the answer might be, well, ask more people from those communities to do more labor that they're already doing and kind of not being compensated for. And so I think the best way to do that is to, again, ask ourselves, those of us who might have positions of power, might be in identities that are not marginalized, how might we change the viewpoint by which we look at the world to have a more equitable review that we can produce?
Right. Excellent. Mike, any suggestions from you?
No, I just want to tell people how deeply I was nodding at what Dom was saying.
Yeah.
You know, it's yeah, I mean, our authors and editors from marginalized backgrounds or historically underrepresented communities, you can say no. You don't have to write about whatever people tell you should write about, right? So yeah, and you can decline things and we'll find other folks to take up the work. So yeah.
Coming back to the theme of the self-care, right, which Mike shared early on. Let's shift a bit back to the life cycle of the book and share with the group. We'll move away from acquisitions a little bit about other initiatives that are underway in aspects like manuscript editing. We know the organization as a whole has been trying to share more resources about who does the editing of the voices, right? So that we're not funneling everything through a white-bodied experience that a lot of publishing has been grounded in. Could any of you share some of these initiatives from other aspects of the life cycle of the book?
I guess I can share that we, on the EJI committee, we are testing out a data and demographics pilot project, which is getting demographics about all sorts of people at the press. So not just your acquisitions editor, but like, what are the freelancers? Like, what's the pool look like over there? What are the peer reviewers look like? What are these, all these different stages in which your manuscript has to go through to become a book, right? And we're still in early stages of creating a toolkit and everything for that. But it's something to be, you know, we're trying to be more aware of what our acquisitions editors look like and how editing is and publishing is so white, but there's so many more people in publishing beyond just acquisitions and the first people that you encounter, right? So yeah.
And Mike, just to clarify, that pilot also, we hope, will be inclusive of all publishing partners, right? So that's the authors and the peer reviewers. If once the pilot is sort of embedded as guidelines, the goal is that it will be across the ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely across the ecosystem. And, you know, different presses would use a tool like that in different ways. And, you know, as if you're an author looking for an anti-racist or press, you know, ask about what initiatives they're involved in, because some presses are completely uninterested in knowing about the networks and barriers they've set up because they're happy with the status quo, right? And yeah, I mean, just thinking from personal experience about like about projects, and like sometimes it's more expensive to hire a cover designer from a particular community who's used to not university press pay, right, for cover design. So like, you know, like maybe you gotta advocate for, maybe we have to advocate for paying those people more, right? Like find money in the budget, put your money where the mouth, put your money into it. And I think it's little things to chip away to make sure that we're as inclusive as possible. So,
Like, there's just a follow-up question in the chat for you, asking if copy editors, manuscript editors are part of the ecosystem that the EJI committee is investigating.
yes, yeah, they are.
Say more.
Okay. So, all right. Yeah. Okay. So it's an early, we're still planning. It's basically a toolkit for presses to gather demographics on the different layers of publishing. So peer reviewers, copy editors, designers, things like that. It's kind of a toolkit that presses can use as they see fit, right? Not every press is gonna want to know about XYZ or certain, you know, their editorial board because they're already intimately familiar, things like that. But yeah, I think it's just, and it'll be hard to draw conclusions from any aggregated data or anything like that because presses work in such different ways with different lists. But it'll be a way for a press to check on themselves and, you know, see what the landscape is basically, and then hopefully work to improve that landscape as far as diversity and inclusion.
Right, to track change, right, is what the hope. Oh, sorry, Dom, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Yeah. I think this is adjacent to that, but one thing that I always do is kind of one of my last, right, conversations I have with an author before kind of officially transferring them across the stream, so to speak, is that I tell them very explicitly, like, you might be the last, I might be the last person of color you see in this process. So what does that mean, right? And always telling them, if there's anything that happens, I want to know, bring it back to me. And that means, you know, being more involved in the process in other spaces than I think I would have thought I would have needed to be before moving into this position, right? But I always tell folks, like, anytime you have a chance to ask and advocate for yourself, I tell them, put somewhere in writing that you want a Black copy editor. If you're writing with multiple languages, you want a copy editor that knows the other language that you might be using. And so things of that matter, I always say, because it helps me at least have the resources I need when I then go to try to advocate. If I can show that there is a request for it or a desire for it, then that obviously that makes the demand makes people go out and do things that they might have not necessarily done before. Before kind of this moment that we're seeing happen right now. And so that's kind of one of the things I always say, an example of why that's important. I mean, I've had meetings or been at meetings where that request has been made, and then people kind of ask, well, I don't understand why that's important, why it's important that they have an Indigenous copy editor if the project's not necessarily about indigeneity, right? So it's just been a lot of educating that's had to happen about like why things are important to folks. Again, one thing I also say, I've worked on projects where people are intentionally writing in African American vernacular English or Black English, and they want someone that knows that, because then you have, I work in copy editor world as well, then you have what the request is they're like, well, just query it, right? So then you have like the editor, the authors kind of copy editing half of their own manuscript because the copy editor doesn't understand the vernacular that they're being asked to engage with. And so the way that we kind of rebuild is a step-by-step of really showing and educating why these things are important as people use more politicized prose, is what I like to call it, in their writing process.
Dom, you bring up something that goes back to a comment you made early on, and that I wrapped as sort of the hidden curriculum as publishing. But what you're encouraging authors to do is to remind authors that they are partners in this endeavor. And I think all of us would emphatically underscore that. And part of the, I think, really critical change underway in university press publishing is a close examination of what may have been perceived or experienced or was a power imbalance for many years, right? This role of kind of gatekeeping, purposeful obfuscation of what happened. And with the transparency, it's designed in the best of ways to be this empowerment, right? Where you ask the questions and that there are people who will ask, what is the best way for authors who are on this call to come forward with those asks and to advocate for themselves if they're not even sure what they can ask for. And this goes through things like contracts. We've talked about a lot of this in EJI settings, right? How do we unpack each aspect of the process to make sure authors are aware of what we entrust and empower them with?
Okay, because I feel like I'm opening up a can of worms just as I'm hearing you ask it. I'm like, oh no, authors asking for everything.
I know.
Don't want that either. Right now that I think about it, but I take this stand. I also have no problem telling an author, no, we're not doing that. So right. I think so. It really kind of does depend. I think my personality comes through very well of like what happens in author meetings. I always say ask your acquisitions editor. So literally the conversation goes, so yeah, you'd like to have someone from a lower marginalized community probably copy edit your book, right? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, great. I will go ahead and I will communicate that to people across the stream. So I always say that your acquisitions editor is, I always say our goal is to be your ally, your advocate, and your partner in this process. I always say we stand as the middleman of advocating both sides of, so as far as what's possible. And I know acquisitions editors are not gonna like this, but I do believe that part of the role we play is playing referee is the wrong metaphor I want to use, because I don't believe that it's an adversarial relationship, but I have had authors reach out to me if they've had an issue somewhere else. And sometimes it's just a matter of miscommunication. Like that's usually what it is. And so it's usually comes from the space of them just not knowing. So I'd rather just kind of over explain what the process is and how it works. So they don't feel like, you know, if you've never been in the position of having to ask yourself, why am I getting the treatment that I'm getting? Is it because of X, Y, and Z? Sometimes it might not be that, but you might have to ask that question sometimes. And I have no problem kind of disclosing even my personal opinion of why something might have happened that went amiss. And so, yeah, I always say reaching out to your acquisitions editor is going to be your best bet. Oftentimes you're making sure that your needs get, that they get articulated again to other people who might not be as familiar with you or your work or the work, you know?
There's a question that came into the Q&A. Should we tackle this?
This is a shift, right? Thank you, Sarah. Yes, this is going back to open access, which I know we touched on briefly and Lori mentioned it in the opening. And the question is, in the last panel, there was an extensive discussion of open access publishing. Is there any way that presses as a whole can remedy non-European inequities in releasing scholarly work in an open access form? So working as a collective, I believe that is the question. Who among us would like to start on the OA?
Can I nominate Sarah? I don't, so we do some open access, but we don't do that much of it. It's somewhat of a conundrum financially, you know, so.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the tricky part of this question is what can presses as a whole do to remedy it? And I don't know that. I mean, I know about a few collective enterprises that you guys probably know about too, like the Tome Initiative, where there are a number of universities that are partnering with university presses to fund open access publishing for their own faculty, but there's some inequities there, right? Because those are largely universities that have the money to throw at their faculty to publish open access. You know, there's you know, the Lever Press, which is a kind of experimental press funded by liberal arts colleges that publishes only open access, and they don't require you to bring any money with you. And I think that's a really neat operation. And then there's, you know, there's some university presses like Michigan and like MIT that are trying to come up with new funding models that are sustainable by asking libraries to pledge to purchase their ebook collections and then using the funding from that to offset the costs of publishing open access without requiring authors to bring money with them. So I don't know of a good like collective solution just yet, but maybe other people have ideas.
Right. And Elizabeth, thank you for chiming in with knowledge unlatched. I mean, I think as Sarah already mentioned, the business models for each press are quite unique, even though we all are of a piece of a cohort. And whether or not the OA is a sustainable business model for every press is another question to be asked and then answered by each of those presses. And I think also presses are very aware of the inequities OA can introduce or escalate in terms of who has access to those funds, because the presses themselves rarely have that funding. So it's either coming from authors or departments or other arrangements. There is currently a working paper underway on OA publishing among university presses that I believe the goal is to have that out next year. So there will be something, if that's an area that interests, that is forthcoming. And John Scher at North Carolina is one of the principal authors, and I'm trying to remember who else is on that, but it is in the works. I want to go back. We've got another interesting question in the Q&A, building on some of the conversation we had about what information authors might have going into the process, particularly first-time authors. So as a follow-up to the earlier conversation, how can authors learn about, for example, how to ask for an Indigenous copy editor? Are presses implementing step processes or systems by which they can make options known to authors in the contracting process? Or is AAUPresses developing a checklist for marginalized authors so they know what questions to ask?
I guess this goes back to the hidden knowledge that's been referenced, right? So, I mean, every press is different, right? So some presses can offer certain things, or then there's generalities about what, you know, generally we have flexibility on that are shared across university presses. But it kind of goes back to working with an editor that you don't feel bad asking in a way that might not be perfectly worded, right? Like just if you're talking to your editor and you can't quite figure out how to ask, but you just express yourself, that's totally fine, you know? But I also recognize that not everybody gets to work with the editor that they want to work with, right? And so advocating for yourself, just asking, usually it's asking isn't a big deal. You know, we can always, we do say no a lot. So, but I don't mind the ask.
I think one of the things that I heard Dom saying, and Dom, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's super important to ask your editor if you want an Indigenous copy editor, a Black copy editor, or a bilingual copy editor. We might not be able to give that to you, but by asking us, that allows us to demonstrate that there's demand. And then we can kind of go back to, you know, the folks in charge and say, like, listen, there is this demand. We need to change the pool of people that we're working with, and we need to figure out how to get more and different people into the pool of copy editors that we work with. Is that something that you had suggested?
Yeah, that's something I always suggest, that is to ask for it. Again, not only when you leave me, well, yeah, when you leave me, and I was just saying, you know, I'm going to back you up. So if you go and you ask the project editor or the managing editor, if it comes back to me, then we've had the conversation about it. is first and foremost what I always ask for. There is a database, it's called Editors of Color, that I would like to let people know about, that does have, this is not just for University Press, it's just in general. It was an initiative to put a database together, again, of copy editors of color, and it's also other type of freelancers. So there's designers, indexers, all types of folks that are kind of part of this freelance labor that the publishing world is very much so dependent upon, where you can find resources also.
Okay, right. So, okay, just clarifying on, so this comes back to the question of informing authors so that they even know to ask rather than how to ask. There have been conversations. I know the Intellectual Property Committee of the AUPresses was talking about some sort of presentations. I think at one point we met with them with the EJI committee to talk about whether to do some webinars on walking through contracts. Again, there would be individualized protocols at the different presses, but some general guidelines, I think, may be something that the organization comes back to, and we can bring this conversation back to those two respective committees to talk further about it too. We've got another, I think this is a question that maybe this is more for the universities actually than for the university presses, but it's what about requiring universities that are well endowed to pay double for open access publications so that another publication by a marginalized author can be funded properly? That is a possibility. I believe there have been some experiments in terms of weighting costs relative to resources of organizations. There's some conversation already about not every university has a university press, so there's some redistribution of resources for those universities that do not have presses, and some arrangements out. So I think this is something, if this interests you, it's also really helpful to talk to the university where you are. This is not a decision that presses can make on their own. Many, and if not most, are operating as departments of the institutions. And so these conversations should include all interested parties, and universities are looking to introduce as much equity and inclusion to their decision-making and funding as well. Let's see, I just want to make sure we've gotten these. I should be keeping time. I probably have missed some 5-minute warning somewhere. It is 8 o'clock, sorry, 7 o'clock Central Time, 8 o'clock Eastern Time. I believe we have time probably for one more question if anybody has. And if no questions, we have time for one more comment from each of our panelists, if you'd like. Okay. Thank you all. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for joining us, everybody who's on the call, and for sharing questions and comments. Lori, may I turn it over to you? Is there any closing remarks?
I just want to offer my thanks too. This has been a wonderful panel, and I'm just, you know, the wealth of information that you shared and the kind of generosity of spirit of this conversation is really so terrific, and just thank you very much. Just want to thank everybody who's tuned in tonight, and these sessions will be available as recordings through our website, and so we invite you to, there have been a lot of resources put into the chat and brought up in the conversation, so please take advantage of that. And you know, it's a work in progress for sure. So we just thank you for being part of this journey with us, and have a good night.
Be well all.
Thank you.
Thank you.